I've always been really fascinated with UFOs and really any sort of. I remember as a kid, my sister and I, our father was an elementary school teacher, and he taught us to read really early. And I remember sort of any interest I showed in any subject, he would rush to the library and bring home books on that subject just to get me reading more and more. And I don't know why, but probably at age 3 or 4 even, I showed this great interest in things like Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot and UFOs. And so I just remember always, as a kid, reading books about UFOs and aliens and that sort of thing. And then, just sort of at the scene in the book and in the movie, my sister and mother and I actually saw, what we thought was a UFO hovering over the house one night. It's very similar to how it happens in the movie. And so that was always something that I was sort of fascinated by. And I remember being in college and writing a short story about this character, because I found it very fascinating how people, when they tell their UFO abduction memories, are really sort of similar to people under hypnosis that then come out with some sort of molestation memory or something. So that kind of began as a short story, I think, and it just kept expanding, and I realized it was much sort of bigger. Well, that word was something I was always really afraid of.
What novel?
In fact, yeah, I even called it the N-word, because it just seemed like something that was so took up so much of your time as a writer, and basically you have to just sign your life over to working on the same thing for years. And I don't know, I think maybe the way that I was able to sign myself over to the idea of writing a novel was, it was kind of like writing 2 novels in a way, because so much of it is this parallel story that jumps between the 2 characters. So it was kind of like, if I got tired of writing about one character, I could write about the other again. And yeah, I guess just writing the short story about Brian, I just realized it was something much more expansive. And at some point I realized that an earlier short story I'd written, which was about the character Neil, had a really similar genesis. And I think it's then that I realized that I should take these 2 stories and sort of put them together. And after that happened, I saw where it should end. And I sort of see the book as this diamond shaped, like it begins with the 2 characters at the same point, but then they go completely opposite ways, and then they eventually, meet again. That's a tough question. I guess my standard answer is both characters are so like me in different ways. To bring it, into this sort of autobiography question, my parents divorced when I was in 5th grade, I think, and before that, my mother had always sort of been, the maybe typical kind of Midwest homemaker kind of wife. And so I think maybe my life up until then was maybe a little bit more like Brian's. But then after my parents divorced, I remember my mom went on this kind of, soul-searching period of drinking and dating other men. And my life then was a lot more like Neil's is in the book and the movie. And I think really, anyone's life is kind of like that. You have times in your life where you might have acted like a different person than you regularly do. And that was what was fun also about writing this book, is I had the 2 lead characters, so I could kind of take experiences from my past that maybe were more like Brian and put them into that part, and the sort of, I don't know, crazier or riskier side of me I could maybe filter into Neil. That was quite a while. I finished the book at the end of 93, and then 94 was, I got the publisher and doing the editing, and then the long time that it takes between actually finishing the book and when the book comes out. And then the book came out in the US in 95, and I think about a year later a company optioned it. Not Greg and not Antidote, not the company that actually wound up making it, but it was a different company, and they wanted me to write the screenplay. So I did, and it actually was accepted to the Screenwriters Lab at Sundance, and that was a great experience. But looking back now, my script is really sort of less like the novel than Greg's was. I think my script, since I wasn't really experienced with writing scripts before, and since I'm not a director, there were certain things about the book that I couldn't imagine ever being filmed.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine, how they would find child actors who could play these parts. So there were a lot of things that I left out. I think my script actually begins with the characters at, the age of 18, and sort of a lot of the past material exists as sort of sketchy little flashbacks. I think less so than I thought it would be. I think the more time that passes, you're able to sort of. I think by the time I was writing the screenplay, I think I was finished with my second book. So the characters of Mysterious Skin were sort of. I don't know. It's not that they were dead, but they were. They just weren't as close to me as they would have been, if I'd just immediately written the screenplay after finishing the novel.
Yeah. And when you were writing the novel, were you envisaging it cinematically at the time?
Yes, but not in the sense of. I think it's dangerous for any writer to write a novel thinking this is going to be a great movie. Sometimes you pick up a novel and, immediately on page 4 or 5, the characters are in some, gunfight or car chase or something, and you just sort of have the feeling that the author is thinking in terms of Hollywood. Yeah. And I think that's dangerous for a novelist. I think it takes away from the sort of most important things about writing a literary novel, which are things like, characterization and realism and dialogue and things like that. So, at the time I wrote Mysterious Skin, it was my first book. I was finishing it for my Master of Fine Arts at Columbia, and I was more concerned with getting my degree and getting this book done. And it was such a writing a first book is such a labor of love because you don't really have your agent and your editor there. And then after you have a first book out, it sort of changes your life because you suddenly have an audience. Whether it's an audience of 2 or an audience of 200,000, you have an audience, and it completely changes how you write, I think. I think no, it would be the closest answer. Once again, I couldn't imagine certain things about the book being filmed. But I think that's what's so great about Greg's film is he figured out a way to use child actors without damaging the actual real human being that's playing the part. And I think one of the amazing things about the film is a lot of people that see it, the first time they see it, one of their initial questions, if we do when we've gone to the festivals and we do Q&As, one of the initial questions is, how did you find kids that were so good to do these roles? Or even more specifically, how did you find parents that would allow their children to play these roles? But the amazing thing is that Greg did, I think, is I always sort of compare it to Psycho, how people see the shower scene and they think they're seeing the knife going into the flesh, but really Hitchcock never actually filmed that. He just did it in such a way that you think you're seeing more than you are. And I think that's sort of similar to the early scenes in Mysterious Skin. Greg filmed it in such a way that you think you're seeing these things happening to these little boys, but if you look really carefully from shot to shot, the way he's edited it, you can tell if you really analyze it that he's not really subjecting these kids to. I think the way Greg puts it is he didn't want to make a film about childhood trauma that would traumatize the children playing the roles. Greg and I he had read the book not long after it was published, and then when I wrote the screenplay for the other company, they actually submitted it to Sundance, and Greg was actually on the board of the people reading scripts that year. So he hadn't met me yet, but he'd read the novel and he really liked the script. And then after Sundance, I'm not sure how we eventually became sort of friends through email. And Greg and I have a really similar taste in music, and so we had a lot of things in common. And we just sort of had this email relationship for 3 or 4 years. And the whole time he was saying that he wanted to make the film, and I just remember sort of long emails where we would just sort of talk about the characters, or he'd ask about some aspect or something. So I think by the time that I realized that it was going to happen and that he was going to make it, I knew then that he was the right person to make it, because he had sort of developed this relationship with me and knew the book better than a lot of other people did. People have asked me, like, how hands-on were you with, as the author? And I wasn't really there for much of the filming. I was there for the New York scenes, and but I think my involvement was maybe different than a lot of other authors, because I'd actually become friends with Greg, but also friends with Brady and Joe, and even in the case of Joe, he and I went back to Kansas together, and so he could see the places where the book is set and meet some of the people that the characters were based on. Yeah, Joe is just amazing. I mean, I'm so happy with all the performances in the film. I couldn't be happier. But Joe sort of did something, beyond the realm of what actors usually do. And he met me before the filming, and then he said, I'm really interested in going back to Kansas. And so, the next thing I knew, a week later, we were, driving around in a rental car to these small towns in Kansas where I'd grown up. And he brought along a tape recorder and his video camera, and just sort of, we went over to my mom's house, and my cousins and friends were over, and he just sort of, set his recorder down in the corner and, let it play while people were talking. And, then I think he brought that back and just sort of played it for the cast, before filming. And it was things like that. And also just, we went to the Little League field where I played as a kid, and we went to my high school, and, in the town where I grew up. And I guess it's just, that's sort of testament to Joe's skill as an actor. He wanted to become this character, so he wanted to sort of live as much of that character's past as possible. That they definitely see a resemblance in the way Joe portrays that character, but not only Joe, but Brady as well, sort of, maybe in the way that I was back then, which, isn't to say that everything about those characters is autobiographical, but certainly a lot of my experiences are kind of, filtered through the characters. Really pretty closely. I think especially in Brady's case, very similar physically to how I imagined that character. The strange thing is, for me, when you write a book, you have a definite idea of how your characters look, obviously, and not only your characters, but your settings and the interiors and everything, really. You just, you spend so much time writing a book, and then so many years pass after you've written it, and so it just exists in your head in that certain way, and I couldn't imagine that ever changing. But now, after seeing the film, I've seen it maybe 7 or 8 times now, and I can't really remember what my vision of the characters physically or the settings. I can't really remember what that was. Now it exists for me in a very different way. So even if I skim through the book now, the characters I see are, Brady and Joe and Jeff and Michelle and Elizabeth. They've taken the place of the images I initially created in my head. It's very strange. But, that's what's so great about Greg getting the film so right for me is, I think it would have been really disappointing if the film hadn't, if I wasn't pleased with the film, because then it would have changed my vision, but in maybe a negative way, but I'm so happy with the film, and the characters look so perfect to me that, it's such an honor. I think since he's finished the film, he told me that he kind of did, and I know the first time I saw it, he maybe seemed a little more nervous than I remember seeing him before. But I don't know. Even before I saw it, I'd seen little bits and pieces, and I'd seen some stills from the film, and I sort of had Joe and Brady, as my close contacts, sort of calling me every day, saying like, "I think you're really gonna like it." So I sort of knew that I was gonna be happy with it, I think. Well, certainly something that I immediately think of when you ask that is just the music, because that's something that you know is so great about film. You can just bend and shape someone's emotion depending on the music that you use, and that's certainly. I wish you could do that with a book. I wish that every book came with like a little soundtrack on every page, and you could sort of change people's ideas and emotions depending on the page they turn. Um, but the soundtrack, I couldn't be happier with the choice of music, and it's all these bands and artists that I grew up loving, and like the Cocteau Twins were my favorite band forever. And if you would have told me, your book's going to be made into a film, I wouldn't have believed it. But then, actually saying that Robin Guthrie was going to do the music for the film, that's just the ultimate for me. So that's certainly the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is I just think it adds so much to the meaning of the book, and the scenes and the situations and theme and atmosphere, just the music that was used for the film. Once again, that's sort of I think the utmost honor in a way, because Greg certainly, there's so much of him in the movie, obviously, but I think it's a nice sort of marriage between my style as a writer and Greg's completely original style as a director. And the great thing is I think he found that balance where he could still make it an obvious Greg Araki film, but it's the first film he's done that's like adapted from someone else's material. So I know a lot of people said like, what is this film going to be like as a Greg Araki film, but through someone else's material. But I think he did such a great job in still making it his film. Yeah, I think that was one of my biggest challenges in writing the book, because for me, I think the most important thing is always making characters as real as possible. So in the character of Neil, he's obviously doing horrible things during the book. As a kid, he abuses another kid in one scene, and then you see him in the book like shoplifting and having sex right and left, and not necessarily things that you would normally see in a character that you want your audience to perceive as positive and honorable and sympathetic and everything else. But for me, that's the challenge. Making your character do human but sometimes horrible things, and still getting your reader to sympathize with them at the end when they're supposed to be sympathizing with them. And I think maybe as in a film it might even be harder, because you don't have that long space of many pages of that a novel has. You just have like your 90 or 100 minutes to convince your audience that this is essentially a good person, even though that what they're seeing might not necessarily be good good deeds. Yes. Yeah, that was definitely a worry, because there's certainly things in the book and in the movie that are, sort of big sensationalist Whether it's the stuff with the UFO or the stuff with, Neil hustling, having sex right and left, that sort of thing. But I think the great thing that Greg did is he has those moments, but they're sort of the punctuating moments in between, sort of, the calm, more serene, more beautiful moments in a way. And I think, if someone were to just see like 3 scenes from the movie and they were certain scenes of Neil's, say, they might think that it was just, a sort of big sensationalist film like that. But I think as a whole, Greg found that right balance between the kind of quieter moments of the book and the more explosive scenes. My professor, my first sort of big writing professor that influenced me as a person and a writer, always told me that, if someday you finish a book and you get it published, you should never really go back and look at it again, because you're always going to see the things that you wish you'd done differently. Because once it's published, you can't really change those things. And I think I kind of feel that same way about the screenplay. I'm so happy with the film and so happy with the way Greg did it that, I think I just have my old screenplay locked away somewhere, but I'm not really interested in looking at it again. Yeah, definitely. I'm trying to finish my 3rd book now, but I also have a couple of sort of fledgling scripts that I've been working on for a while. And I've always been a big horror film fanatic, so there's sort of a horror film screenplay that I've been working on for a while that maybe a little bit more psychological horror, but definitely has some of the, blood and guts horror in it also. Yeah, it's called We Disappear. I'm really hoping to be done before the fall of this year, so we'll see. It's the great thing about having the movie coming out is it's sort of given me the extra kick in the pants that I need to finish the book. That's been a question that people have had sort of from the beginning, is, in terms of my audience, what I'm sure Greg gets that question too. But I think, some of the characters in the book are gay, some are not. But I think the initial theme or the initial conflict or problem of the film is sort of universal, or I don't know. I think the film would essentially have a lot of the same concerns if it was 2 girls instead of 2 boys. So I don't know. I hope that it has a pretty universal appeal. Yeah, definitely. Some of the most positive responses we've gotten so far have been from older women. I think there's something about the story that brings out kind of a maternal instinct in people. So that's certainly been, some of the more positive feedback we've gotten have been at the festivals from older women. I do, but that's like UFO is basically saying, like, you don't know what you believe in, you just believe that there's something strange out there going on. But I think that's sort of the reason why I have the character Avalon in the book, is I didn't want people to think that I was like debunking UFO abductee stories or something by this. I just think that the kind of wrong recovered memory that Brian has in the book is just his story, but I didn't necessarily want to say that all the people that have these UFO memories are actually substituting them for something else, because I think if so many people have similar stories like that, there must be something strange going on there. Yeah, that's one of the things when people say, oh, there must be parts of the book that are true. That's one thing that they don't necessarily mean. Like they probably think that that's just something that I added, but that's actually the way it is in the film is very close to how it happened in real life.